You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing the current tension between Japan and China. Japanese and Chinese diplomats met on Wednesday for urgent talks over a group of disputed islands in the East China Sea. Those negotiations on the fringes of the UN General Assembly meeting seem to have had little success. At the heart of the dispute are 5 small, largely barren islands called Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China. The latest row over them began this month when the Japanese government said it would buy 3 of them from a businessman. That move triggered angry protests in cities across China, forcing Japanese businesses there to close and a warning from China that economic ties could be affected. So does this tussle over the islands illustrate relations between Asia's 2 biggest economies are at a particularly low ebb, or is this a minor blip in their often stormy relationship? Joining me to discuss this is Professor James Woodhousen of De Montfort University here in the UK, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo of King's College London, and on the line from Hong Kong we have Andrew Leung, an independent expert on China. While from Moscow's Russian People's Friendship University, we have Professor Yuri Tavrovsky. So can I just start with you, Professor Woodhousen? We've had previous spats over these islands. Is this one particularly significant?
I think it is pretty significant, really. It's the 40th anniversary of the Sino-Japanese cooperation agreements put together in 1972. And it coincides, of course, with President Obama's pivot to Asia. And I think the American leitmotif behind all of this dispute is that America is bound by its treaty with Japan to defend Japan's ownership and protection of the Senkaku Islands. And America has been making more aggressive noises, opposing China's rise in Asia and in the seas of East China and South China. And I think, therefore, it's not just the immediate contenders, Taiwan, China and Japan around the Senkaku, or the other contenders for other islands. It's also a dispute involving America in decline and China on the ascent.
Dr. Pardo, do you agree with that? It's very much a one involving America as well as China and Japan.
I think the U.S. somehow has to be involved because of its relationship with Japan, so I do agree on that point. I do not necessarily agree with the point being made of this being a very significant dispute, in the sense that these disputes have been ongoing in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea for a long time. It is significant. It is true that this is the 40th anniversary of the treaty between both countries. It's a very significant date. But on the other hand, I think that the dispute probably will be solved in the not-so-distant future. And then we will see more disputes in the future, but I don't think that relations between both countries will be significantly affected. Especially after we have the change of government in China. We will see, I think, how things start to turn to normal between both countries.
Andrew Leung in Hong Kong, how does it feel when you're in China and you're seeing this dispute, some people say being whipped up? Does it feel like it's top-down or bottom-up?
Well, it's definitely bottom-up at first, but then, of course, it has been managed from the top. But what we're seeing now is an almost explosion of nationalism. Dating back to the recent history. Don't forget, China was invaded by Japan, and some of the old atrocities, memories is still fresh, and now some of the old wounds are being reopened in China. Added to this, of course, is Japan's perceived failure to admit to its past guilt. I mean, there are certain denials of past atrocities, not only to China but to Korea as well. Now, as my colleagues were saying, I mean, this disputes have been with us for a long, long time. So what's so special now? But what is special now is that Japan has been extremely assertive in exerting its claims, and this, of course, puts China in a very, very difficult position. There is no way that the China's leadership, least of all the new leadership, could be seen to be weak in face of Japan as a past aggressor and as China's economy is now the second largest in the world, and the national pride in China being a powerful nation now, would prevent any kind of appearance of weakness. So I think that this is significant, and this kind of confluence of forces, of dynamics, is what makes this current dispute unique.
Professor Tavrovsky in Moscow,
yes.
Is there a danger perhaps of escalation, as we've just heard from Andrew Lung, of perhaps even military confrontation?
Well, I don't think that there'll be a real big-scale military confrontation, let's say war. I think that both sides are not interested in a war. They are not prepared for a war. Maybe in a few years it will happen, but not now. And, a few days ago when the Chinese flotilla, consisting of almost 1,000 fishing ships, was moving towards the Diaoyudo or Senkaku, and there were some Chinese patrol boats, and 6 big Japanese patrol boats were in the Senkaku vicinity. Well, the world was expecting something to happen, but then sort of miracle happened, and there was no confrontation, and nobody knows about that flotilla. Fortunately, United States Defense Secretary Leon Panetta visited first Tokyo and then Beijing, and so maybe it was taken as a pretext for both sides to stop the hostilities. And right now, this morning I was reading an article in a very important Chinese newspaper called Global Times. It's published in English, but it belongs to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And the title is "Risk of Armed Asian Conflict on the Rise, but Trade Links Rule Out War." And they several times underline that there won't be any war. One certain thing is that a war is unlikely in the Asia-Pacific.
Sorry, Dr. Woodhausen, you're trying to come in here, I think.
Well, I quite agree that, the danger of an immediate war shouldn't be exaggerated. But I don't agree with Ramon, my friend here, that the dispute will be resolved anytime soon. I think it could go to the back burner, but I don't know that it's going to be resolved, because behind it is not oil resources or even nationalism, certainly on a scale of the pre-war era in Japan and China. There's a bit of nationalism, but the protests in China don't compare with the strikes against the regime in China, which are much more violent and many more people involved. There are more, mobile phones taking pictures of a Japanese car being hit in the tires than there are real explosions of mass anger. I think that's been overdone by the press, although I'd be very interested to hear what Andrew Lung says about that and the real scale as opposed to the reported scale of the protest. But I think although an immediate war isn't likely, there is a lot of history on both sides, and therefore, the fact that a flotilla doesn't get embroiled in a really violent action doesn't mean that couldn't happen tomorrow, and that couldn't lead to a dramatic raising of tensions in the whole area. I'm surprised to hear from one of your interviewees that neither China nor Japan are prepared for a war. I think if you went to their armed forces, they'd tell you they were very prepared. And I'm also surprised to hear the old canard that because they trade a great deal between each other, China and Japan will not go to war. The illusions that surrounded the First World War between Britain and Germany, when there were enormous trade and investment links in that period, many people thought it was impossible they could go to war for economic reasons, but war is not a rational enterprise, gentlemen. It's something that can be triggered by passions, by incidents, and by a spiral going out of control. So I don't think trade is in any way a guarantee that the whole place will calm down.
Dr. Pardo.
I do not agree with the point being made of a war being a possibility in the region. I mean, we have seen tensions, for example, between both Koreas, and they haven't escalated, no? And this could have actually triggered a real war between both countries. And I think the situation is similar in between China, Japan, and even including Korea, Taiwan. What I think is that military confrontation in East Asia, it is highly unlikely, not only because of trade links, but also because we have many, for example, foreign minister meetings that take place at least once a year. We have many meetings between the militaries of the different countries. So we see an increase in contacts that go beyond trade that make this unlikely. So I'm not saying the situation is as calm as it might be within the European Union, for example, but we do see all these links, including the +3 countries, ASEAN +3, countries in Northeast Asia themselves, that I think make war quite unlikely. And I think, if anything, the probability of war has been decreasing since the 1980s, basically since the end of the Cold War.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis. And today we're discussing the tension between China and Japan. I'm joined by Professor James Woodhousen of De Montfort University here in the UK, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo of King's College London, and on the line from Hong Kong we have Andrew Leung, an independent expert on China, and from Moscow's Russian People's Friendship University we have Professor Yuri Tavrovsky. Andrew Leung, to go back to the question that was posed, when we saw these pictures of protesters in China, were there more people taking pictures on their mobile phones that were actually protesting?
Definitely there are people always taking pictures on mobile phones now. The mobile phone population in China is the largest in the world. But nowhere in recent history have we seen such a wide scale of protests across different cities in China, over 100 cities, all over the nation. Yes, there was some official participation and even connivance, but I don't think it's all whipped up, sort of by the Beijing. This, as I was saying, and unleashing sort of pent-up nationalism, especially against Japan because of history. Now, going back to war, my colleagues are quite right. I mean, both countries are prepared for war, but I'd also agree with my colleagues that neither of them wants a war. But I think that the tragedy sometimes is that it's a tragedy of unintended consequences because things can get out of hand very quickly.
Professor Tavrovsky, we have the Chinese this week launching their first aircraft carrier. Do you see any significance in this as a way of saying to Japan and America, look, we're capable of moving ahead militarily?
Well, I think this is purely coincidence. But of course, China is beefing up its navy. 90% of Chinese experts go by sea. So, and there is an opportunity, the possibility that, say, America, because it tries to contain China, will somehow try to squeeze the Malacca Strait or other shipping lines. So China is trying to beef up its navy. And but as my colleague from Hong Kong stressed, China is now much weaker than America. But speaking of America apparently is not interested in full-scale war in Asia-Pacific. What it is interested in is low-intensity conflicts and operations. If a war starts between Japan and China, then America will have to take a crucial decision. According to the Japan-America Security Treaty, it has to help. And Foreign Secretary Clinton several times reiterated that America will help. On the other hand, Defense Secretary Panetta stressed both in Tokyo and in Beijing that America doesn't want to take sides in this conflict. And another very bad consequence for America is that there are many influential politicians in Japan now demanding Japanese nuclear arms to confront Korea and China. So I don't think America is interested, and it will allow the Japanese to go to war. As for the Chinese, I think that Chinese Communist Party controls its armed forces, and it won't allow any, accidental use of arms. So I'm still insisting that neither side is prepared or inclined for a real war.
Professor Woodhausen, are we in danger of talking this up too much? I mean, both these countries, China and Japan, do have leadership elections or leadership changes coming up. Is this perhaps not just saber-rattling by some people within the various governments to try and make them look good, basically, ahead of these leadership changes?
Well, I don't think even Andrew Leung in Hong Kong, and certainly us Europeans and Tavarovsky in Russia, are really talking anything up. We're not the guilty parties for the tensions that are happening there. And, alarmism really isn't going to help anybody. I'm sure there's a lot of common ground here.
But we have seen spats like this over territorial disputes. I mean, there was one over these same islands in 2010, and that just went up and back down again.
Yes, well, I can agree with Ramon that there has been a warming of Sino-Japanese relations, really since around 2008, not least about cooperation in gas in the South China Sea. And there are also, as he rightly points out, more diplomatic meetings. There's more attempts at cooperation. But we also know, don't we, from history, that just as things can spiral out of control on the ocean, they can in diplomatic negotiations. If you don't meet the right person at the right time, you say that your diary is too full, and so on. Offence can be taken, face can be lost, which is nothing to exaggerate by us Europeans, but I think is a little bit of a factor in Asia, not losing face. And the weakness of both China and Japan's governments at the moment, with all the shenanigans around Xi Jinping going lost for 10 days, and now Yoshihiko Noda, having just 20% support in the polls, we shouldn't force it into a sort of Western narrative that, they all want to wag the dog with nationalism and all of these things and to distract attention. It's not quite so simple. But I don't believe that the popular passions in China about Japan's very regrettable, Japanese imperialism's very regrettable intervention in China, I don't think the younger generation in China feels all the things that we could so easily ascribe to them. It's a long time. It's not recent history. They've lost uncles and grandfathers to this, but many of them know, and I've talked to them, that young Japanese are no more responsible for what happened in the rape of Nanjing than are young Germans today responsible for the Holocaust. I think what is dangerous about the situation,
but there is a fundamental difference, having lived in China myself, is that you talk to young Chinese people about the Japanese occupation, they'll get very upset about it in a way that wouldn't happen with European children talk about the Second World War, I think. It still is a live issue, the Japanese occupation, in a way that it isn't in Europe, no?
Well, it's bigger, but if you talk to Jews or Israelis about the Holocaust, you'll find similar emotions, and I don't want to take anything away from that. What I'm saying is that the simple Western narratives of it's all nationalism and all of that, or it's all resources, or even, and there's much more grounds for this, that it's trade routes and so on. They're all very well, but I think the striking thing and what is new about the situation is the arbitrariness of international relations. Let's not forget that, Japan and Korea are in dispute on the Dokdo Islands, as the Koreans call it, and yet Japan and South Korea are both allies of America. Let's not forget that Obama couldn't really decide whether to intervene in Libya or in Syria and in these kinds of places, and a lot of the time you're fighting wars nowadays, for example, the British in Afghanistan, for reasons that change by the week or maybe no reasons at all. So in this respect, the simple slights on the ocean waves or in the diplomatic conference room and desires to move ahead in the opinion polls or to be re-elected or these sorts of things, there's an arbitrariness to international relations today which is not to do with resources and trade routes and so on, but is to do with what side of bed you got out in the morning, and that is very dangerous. Things can go out of control there. A full-scale war, no, it's going to be prefaced, if there is one, it'll be prefaced by a long period of tension and alliances and diplomacy and some warming of relations, some cooling of relations. That's not what we're saying. Is the overall situation very intractable because of the course of the 20th century? Have things calmed down in the past and therefore they will definitely calm down in the future? No, it is a bit intractable, becoming more intractable. And things are not guaranteed to calm down. No war tomorrow, but it's not guaranteed to calm down.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis. And today we're discussing the tension between China and Japan. I'm joined by Professor James Woodhausen of De Montfort University here in the UK, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo of King's College London. And on the line from Hong Kong, we have Andrew Leung, an independent expert on China. And from Moscow's Russian People's Friendship University, we have Professor Yuri Tavorovsky. Dr. Pardo, did you see it as becoming more intractable or less?
I think there has been a failure in dealing with these issues properly, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. So in a sense, it is true that it is becoming more intractable insofar the longer this goes on, obviously, the more and more each country is going to defend its own position. So we have seen attempts, for example, through the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus to have more countries involved in dealing specifically with the South China Sea, and this hasn't really led to anything yet. So in a sense, it is true that if countries in the region, and I include the US here because of the military presence in the region, if they are not able to solve these issues soon, or let's say over the next 5-10 years, then the positions are not going to change from either country. And I think even Andrew mentioned before, within Japan we see an increase in assertiveness, which is a very important change in East Asia. This is something that wasn't there before. And the more assertive generation of politicians in Japan are less willing to compromise and are definitely less willing to give way to the demands of other countries. In South Korea, we see something similar. North Korea is not the main issue in South Korea anymore. You talk to South Korean people. I just came back from there, talking to people in government. They are more concerned with, for example, territorial disputes with Japan, for example, possible trade being diverted towards China. So what we do see here is that unless there is a proper meeting in which leaders come together and say, okay, we're going to solve these issues one by one, and this is unlikely, I think, in the short term, unless we have this type of meeting, yes, the problems are going to become intractable, and we will see tensions. I don't think we will see any sort of war, but I think there will be tensions that will be, well, they will be stronger, they will be lighter according to the circumstances.
Professor Tavorovsky in Moscow, are we seeing on both sides, China and Japan, more assertiveness? We were just talking now about Japan being a more generation of more assertive politicians, but of course, is that also happening in China?
Yes. I was in Beijing a few months ago, and I visited a Museum of National Anti-Japanese War on the famous Marco Polo Bridge. And I was very surprised. There are thousands of young Chinese moving around this big museum, making pictures with their telephones, and the mood was, I spoke to them, and they are very, very much anti-Japanese. And, I think that this is actually part of the bigger problem, because Japan has territorial problems with all the three neighbors, China, Korea, and Russia. And compare it with another country which was initiator of the Second World War, Germany. I don't think there are anti-Germany feelings now in Europe. In Russia, they are almost inexistent. And Germany doesn't have any territorial claims to Poland, to Russia, or France, any country. And can you imagine a monument to 35 million killed Chinese in the center of Tokyo? While in Berlin, there is a monument to 6 million European Jews killed there. And German Chancellor knelt in one of the extermination camps in Poland. Can you imagine a Japanese Prime Minister praying to the memories of those Chinese and Southeast Asians killed by the Imperial Army? So I think the problem is that the Japanese didn't repent. And so this hatred not only in Korea and in China, it won't subside, and it will give birth to more and more problems for Japan.
Okay, Andrew Leung, we have economy in Japan doing very badly, but you also have a Chinese economy that's not doing as well as it has been recently. Is there a danger that even if this doesn't go to a full-scale war, there might be economic repercussions of the two largest economies in Asia having trouble?
Well, definitely. I mean, if there is a conflict, I mean, even if a temporary conflict would send both economies further down. But I don't think that there is no doubt that there will be an impact on the economy. But I think the most important thing is that this degree of unpredictability. My colleague referred to this as arbitrariness, or I would refer it as serendipity. In other words, unintended consequences. And these unintended consequences are all resting upon all these historical factors. The fact that, as my colleague was saying, of Japan not really tuning in full for its past, for its wartime past, and Japan being more assertive, and of course China's nationalism being on the rise because of China's economy and so on and so forth. So all these factors are coming into play. But I think the one recent the turn of events is the resort to the United Nations. For example, the Japanese Prime Minister is going to make a statement in the United Nations, and of course the Chinese Foreign Minister is perfectly prepared for that, and taking this opportunity to lay plain Chinese historical claims, which China has never in the past been able to do. So I think that would be a useful forum, and hopefully this would calm down emotions a little bit. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility of even minor crashes, getting out of hand. But the other unknown factor, of course, is the position of America. Now, of course, America can stay out of even minor crashes, but in case of a major escalation, there's no way that America could stay out, and this could provide the further, pouring further oil to the fire. But then the irony is that none of these parties really want a war. These of all China and of course not Japan and not the United States. But sometimes if things get out of control, it will be very, very difficult for any of these countries to manage the situation.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Just one last one, Professor Woodhausen.
Well, I think it's a little glib, if I may, to say that, Japan has not repented for the war in the way that Germany does. I mean, I was very careful in my earlier remarks to talk about Japanese imperialism. I think if you're talking about an idiot like Yoshihiko Noda and or Koizumi's visit to the Yasuveni shrine and, sort of jumping on the...
an idiot, but they're both prime ministers or have been prime ministers.
Yeah, but they enjoy very little domestic support, and their willingness to accommodate the spent embers of Japanese nationalism is very spineless. But that doesn't mean that the Japanese population suffers genuine collective guilt or won't atone for its past misdeeds. The majority of the Japanese population is pacifist in outlook and certainly doesn't want a war with China and doesn't have much in common with Ishihara and all the nationalists in Japan. So I think we do have to distinguish between the regime, which is faltering, and the sentiments of the people. I think the same is relevant in Korea and China.
Well, that's all we have time for. May I just thank my guests, Professor James Woodhausen of De Montfort University, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo of King's College London, and from Hong Kong, Andrew Liang, independent expert on China, and from the Russian People's Friendship University, Professor Yuri Tavrovsky. Thank you all very much.
American leitmotif behind all of this dispute is that America is bound by its treaty with Japan to defend Japan's ownership and protection of the Senkaku Islands, and America has been making more aggressive noises opposing China's rise in Asia and in the seas of East China and South China. And I think, therefore, it's not just the immediate contenders, Taiwan, China and Japan around the Senkaku, or the other contenders for other islands. It's also a dispute involving America in decline and China on the ascent.
Dr. Pardo, do you agree with that? It's very much one involving America as well as China and Japan.
I think the US somehow has to be involved because of its relationship with...
How does it feel when you're in China and you're seeing this dispute, some people say being whipped up? Does it feel like it's top-down or bottom-up?
Well, it's definitely bottom-up at first, but then, of course, it has been managed from the top. But what we're seeing now is an almost explosion of nationalism dating back to the recent history. Don't forget, China was invaded by Japan, and some of the old atrocities. Memories is still fresh, and now some of the old wounds are being reopened in China. Added to this, of course, is Japan's perceived failure to admit to its past guilt. I mean, there are certain denials of past atrocities, not only to China, but to Korea as well.
The islands illustrate relations between Asia's two biggest economies are at a particularly low ebb, or is this a minor blip in their often stormy relationship? Joining me to discuss this is Professor James Woodhousen of De Montfort University here in the UK, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo of King's College London, and on the line from Hong Kong we have Andrew Leung, an independent expert on China. While from Moscow's Russian People's Friendship University, we have Professor Yuri Tavrovsky. So can I just start with you, Professor Woodhousen? We've had previous spats over these islands. Is this one particularly significant?
I think it is pretty significant, really. It's the 40th anniversary of the Sino-Japanese cooperation agreements put together in 1972, and it coincides, of course, with President Obama's pivot to Asia. And I think
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing the current tension between Japan and China. Japanese and Chinese diplomats met on Wednesday for urgent talks over a group of disputed islands in the East China Sea. Those negotiations on the fringes of the UN General Assembly meeting seem to have had little success. At the heart of the dispute are 5 small, largely barren islands called Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China. The latest row over them began this month when the Japanese government said it would buy 3 of them from a businessman. That move triggered angry protests in cities across China, forcing Japanese businesses there to close, and a warning from China that economic ties could be affected. So does this tussle over
with Japan, so I do agree on that point. I do not necessarily agree with the point being made of this being a very significant dispute, in the sense that these disputes have been ongoing in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea for a long time. It is significant. It is true that this is the 40th anniversary of the treaty between both countries. It's a very significant date. But on the other hand, I think that the dispute probably will be solved in the not-so-distant future. And then we will see more disputes in the future, but I don't think that relations between both countries will be significantly affected, especially after we have the change of government in China. We will see, I think, how things start to turn to normal between both countries.
Andrew Leung in Hong Kong.